Talk to Job today is a real depressing situation. He's not a man of much hope. He's one of those negative Nellies who has nothing good to say. Woe is me, life is awful, my nights drag on without end, the days fly by, it's just, I wish I were dead. There is no happiness, he ends. I will never see another happy day again. Completely and utterly devoid of hope and completely unjoyful. Job, when we take a look and step back at the book of Job, we realize that the whole book of Job basically has this point. God is God and we are not. That's kind of the thesis of the book of Job. And in not being God, our lives are not perfect. Our lives are not clean and tidy, and our lives are not without struggle and turmoil and unhappiness. And Job reflects that today. He talks about how deep his struggles are, how miserable he is. And some would say, well, Job, perhaps you deserved it. Perhaps this is punishment for you. Perhaps this is some kind of test that you have to go through. Perhaps there is something that God doesn't like and is trying to purge out of your life. But we know that's not the case. Because as the book of Job opens up, God begins by saying, look at my servant Job, how wonderful he is. How good is this man. He is so blessed and he is so good. And he goes on praising Job. So God is now punishing him, and yet Job is experiencing all kinds of turmoil. He loses everything practically in his life, and now sits in misery, without hope, in the darkness. That is, in a nutshell, human life. Our lives are full of misery. Our lives are full of trial and suffering and tragedy and all kinds of things that we have not planned, nor would we ever wish even upon our enemies. Our lives are full of difficulty. We are not God. And nevertheless, we are called to not respond the way Job does in this deep, deep depression, but rather to recognize, as St. Paul says, God became weak so that he could meet us in our weakness. That we cannot listen to the voice of the tempter who says, you're being tested. God is trying you by this to test your faith. We cannot listen to the voice of the tempter that says, you've done something wrong. You're being punished for your wickedness. God is the one who took your loved one away. We cannot listen to that voice, because when we do, our response is to hate God. God, how could you do this to me? How could you not care about me? How could you take my loved one away from me? How could you leave me in this situation? Well, God doesn't. All of that is a lie. God does not bring about our misfortune, our trials, our struggles, our testings. Rather, God comes into those places to lift us out of them. The reason Job is so miserable is because he stopped looking at God and started looking at himself. And he said, look at how wretched I am. Look at how miserable I am. Look at everything that I've lost. Look at all of my sufferings. Well, of course you're going to be miserable if you look at all of that. He took his eyes off of God. We are called, no matter where we are, to keep our eyes fixed on God. That is how we get lifted out of those places, and do not end by saying, I will never see happiness again, woe is me. No. Jesus today reveals to us that he comes into weakness. He He comes into suffering and into trouble and into pain. He comes into those places. He came to Simon's house because that's where his mother-in-law was. He didn't wait outside and say, "Why don't you bring me your mother-in-law?" Drag her out of her bed and walk her across the town square so I can heal her. He came to her weakness. He met her in her fever. And you'd have to say, I'm sure that if Simon's mother-in-law was told in her childhood, "You will meet the Savior, and you will meet him when you are completely and utterly sick, when you are with fever and hallucinating, that's when you're going to meet the Savior." And she would probably say to that, "Well, then I don't want to. I don't want to meet God in that situation." And then she never would have been healed. That's exactly where God wanted to meet her. And it says that after that, Jesus then healed those who were sick and possessed by demons. And then he didn't stay around. He didn't stick around and say, "Okay, now that we're all well, let's have a party." He didn't say, "Let's feast and enjoy all of this." He took off, even without his disciples. They had to chase after him. "Where are you going?" "I'm going to the weak ones. I'm going to the ones whose lives are a mess. I'm going to those possessed. I'm going there because that's why I came. I have to enter into people's weakness so as to bring them out of it." And so we see the cruel instrument of death on our wall has been turned into a source of blessing. That just as Jesus made the cross the source of blessing, so he has made our trials, our struggles, our difficulties also a place of blessing. If we keep our eyes fixed on him. If we turn our eyes on ourselves and say, "Look at how sad I am. Look at how broken things are. Look at how bad it is," well, then it will be. And that's what we will experience. But if in the midst of that we say, "Look at how close the Lord stays with me. Look at how he continues to grace me. Look at how I never have to be afraid, even though I don't see ahead of me, because Jesus is with me," then all of a sudden the door begins to open, and we find our way out of that darkness. It may be a little bit of a walk through a tunnel, but nevertheless there is light at the end of that tunnel. Jesus comes to rescue us from our darkness, and he will meet us there if we take the eyes off of ourselves and look at him. And so rather than saying, "Woe is me, how miserable things are," we are called to always keep our eyes fixed on Jesus. Because when we do that, when we let him into our darkest places, he calls us out of them. He is the only door that pulls us out of our darkness. And so by requesting, opening, and finding Jesus, like Simon's mother-in-law, he will lift us out of our place of torment so that we can begin doing what we wanted to do, to serve him, to reach out to others, to live our lives fully once again. Let Christ in to your darkness so that he can call you out into the light.